All right, I'm ready. Hello, and welcome back to Read Aloud with Dan. That's me. Today we're reading Mao's On Contradiction, Section 4, the principal contradiction and the principal aspect of a contradiction. We'll jump right in. Why not? There are still 2 points in the problem of the particularity of contradiction, which we just discussed in the previous section. It's always assumed that you've read previous sections, including any other previous works that maybe were also suggested to you to read before you get into this. But, if you're here, just randomly listening in to section 4, just hang on tight. You're going to do your best. Here we go. 2 points in the problem of the particularity of contradiction, which must be singled out for analysis, namely, the principal contradiction and the principal aspect of a contradiction. And that's he's laying out what we're going to get into in this section, the principal contradiction and the principal aspect of any single contradiction. He says, there are many contradictions in the process of development of a complex thing. And one of them is necessarily the principal contradiction, whose existence and development determine or influence the existence and development of the other contradictions. Okay, so whenever you got a big complex thing, it's full of contradictions. It's full of them. It's chock full. It's full of the gills. This is what he says. And he says, one's the most important because it's bumping into all the rest and influencing them and their development. It's always going to be the case. There's always one primary guy. There's always one main boss, is what he says. Reading on, he says, for instance, in capitalist society, that's where I live. The 2 forces in contradiction, the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, form the principal contradiction. It's the main boss. Just sit on that for a second. The other contradictions, such as those between the remnant feudal class and the bourgeoisie, between the peasant petty bourgeoisie and the bourgeoisie, between the proletariat and the peasant petty bourgeoisie, between the non-monopoly capitalists and the monopoly capitalists, between bourgeois democracy and bourgeois fascism, among the capitalist countries, and between imperialism and the colonies. He says the other contradictions are all determined or influenced by this principal contradiction. That's what he's saying. The other contradictions, the non-primary contradiction, are all determined or influenced by this principal contradiction. In a semi-colonial country such as China, in 1937 at the time of writing, the relationship between the principal contradiction and the non-principal contradictions presents a complicated picture. When imperialism launches a war of aggression against such a country, all its various classes, except for some traitors, can temporarily unite in a national war against imperialism. I love how he goes, except for some traitors. At such a time, the contradiction between imperialism and the country concerned becomes the principal contradiction. While all the contradictions among the various classes within the country, including what was the principal contradiction between the feudal system and the great masses of the people, all the contradictions among the various classes within the country are temporarily relegated to a secondary and subordinate, cucked position. So it was in China in the Opium War of 1840, the Sino-Japanese War of 1894, and the Yihetuan War of 1900. Apologies for any pronunciation errors. And so it is now in the present Sino-Japanese War. All right. So contradictions change and develop, and the principal contradiction sometimes becomes the secondary one. Yeah. He says, but in another situation, the contradictions change position. When imperialism carries on its oppression not by war, but by milder means, political, economic, and cultural, and it does, the ruling classes in semi-colonial countries capitulate to imperialism, and the two form an alliance for the joint oppression of the masses of the people. That is how the world works. At such a time, the masses often resort to civil war against the alliance of imperialism and the feudal classes, while imperialism often employs indirect methods rather than direct action in helping the reactionaries in the semi-colonial countries to oppress the people, and thus the internal contradictions become particularly sharp. We're talking here about like NGOs, NED, the cultural war, the Congress for Cultural Freedom, and color revolutions, sort of like political coups, economic imperialism, such as like cooing with the banks instead of with the tanks. He says this is what happened in China in the Revolutionary War of 1911, the Revolutionary War of 1924 to 1927, and the 10 years of Agrarian Revolutionary War in 1927. Wars among the various reactionary ruling groups in the semi-colonial countries, that is, the wars among the warlords in China, fell into the same category. I'm not going to get into those too much right now. When a revolutionary civil war develops to the point of threatening the very existence of imperialism and its running dogs, the domestic reactionaries, imperialism often adopts other methods in order to maintain its rule. It either tries to split the revolutionary front from within, or sends armed forces to help the domestic reactionaries directly. They also just send guns. At such a time, foreign imperialism and domestic reaction stand quite openly at one pole, while the masses of the people stand at the other pole, thus forming the principal contradiction, which determines or influences the development of other contradictions. The assistance given by various capitalist countries to the Russian reactionaries after the October Revolution is an example of armed intervention. Chiang Kai-shek's betrayal in 1927 is an example of splitting the revolutionary front. But whatever happens, there is no doubt at all that at every stage in the development of a process, there is only one principal contradiction which plays the leading role. Hence, and this is important. You could tell because I highlighted it. Hence, if in any process there are a number of contradictions, one of them must be the principal contradiction playing the leading and decisive role, while the rest occupy a secondary and subordinate position. You may think he's repeating himself, and fair enough, Some people learn through repetition, okay? Just let him bring the point home. So he says, therefore, in studying any complex process in which there are two or more contradictions, we must devote every effort to finding its principal contradiction. I didn't notice that typo before. Neither did the publisher. Once this principal contradiction is grasped, all problems can be readily solved, more or less. This is the method Marx taught us in his study of capitalist society. Likewise, Lenin and Stalin taught us this method when they studied imperialism and the general crisis of capitalism, and when they studied the Soviet economy. There are thousands of scholars and men of action who do not understand it, and the result is that, lost in a fog, they are unable to get to the heart of a problem and naturally cannot find a way to resolve its contradictions. As we have said, one must not treat all the contradictions in a process as being equal, but must distinguish between the principal and the secondary contradictions, and pay special attention to grasping the principal one. But in any given contradiction, whether principal or secondary, should the two contradictory aspects be treated as equal? Again, no. In any contradiction, the development of the contradictory aspects is uneven. That's just reality. Sometimes they seem to be in equilibrium, which is, however, only temporary and relative. While unevenness is basic. Of the two contradictory aspects, one must be principal and the other secondary. The principal aspect is the one playing the leading role in the contradiction. The nature of a thing is determined mainly by the principal aspect of a contradiction, the aspect which has gained the dominant position. But this situation is not static. The principal and the non-principal aspects of a contradiction transform themselves into each other. And the nature of the thing changes accordingly. Now, what he's not saying here is the two things transform into each other. He's saying the two principal aspects of the contradiction changes into each other. So it's not like, think of a contradiction, bourgeoisie, proletariat. It's not like the proletariat becomes the bourgeoisie and the bourgeoisie. No, that's not how a revolution would work. Right? It's the aspects of that relationship would change. Okay, reading on. No, not reading on. The aspects of that relationship would change, as in the power would change, would transform into the other. Okay, reading on. He says, in a given process or at a given stage in the development of a contradiction, A is the principal aspect and B is the non-principal aspect. At another stage or in another process, the roles are reversed. A change determined by the extent of the increase or decrease in the force of each aspect in its struggle against the other in the course of the development of a thing. We often speak of the new superseding the old. The supersession of the old by the new is a general, eternal, and inviolable law of the universe. Violable? I don't know. The transformation of one thing into another through leaps of different forms in accordance with its essence and external conditions. This is the process of the new superseding the old. In each thing, there is a contradiction between its new and its old aspects. And this gives rise to a series of struggles with many twists and turns. Ooh, that's exciting. As a result of these struggles, the new aspect changes from being minor to being major and rises to predominance, while the old aspect changes from being major to being minor and gradually dies out. And the moment the new aspect gains dominance over the old thing changes qualitatively into a new thing. It can thus be seen that the nature of a thing is mainly determined by the principal aspect of the contradiction, the aspect which has gained predominance. Make sure I highlight that one. When the principal aspect which has gained predominance changes, the nature of a thing changes accordingly. Oh, snap. That's science, baby. We're abstracting science, and by doing so, we're getting closer to understanding reality itself. It's fascinating. In capitalist society, capitalism has changed its position from being a subordinate, cucked force in the old feudal era to being the dominant, dom force. I'm not sure if I'm using these terms wrong. And the nature of society has accordingly changed from feudal to capitalist, despite the fact that there are still elements of feudalism. So I don't know, when there's, I don't know, a place that's like, has like pretty much a dictatorship of the proletariat, but they still have elements of capitalism. Should we call that capitalism? Even though fundamentally it's different. Anyways, that's for another discussion. No, it's actually sort of the same. We're still talking about China. It's just we're talking about China right now, and that debate that I'm referencing. He says, in the new capitalist era, this is 1937, the feudal forces changed from their former dominant position to a subordinate one, gradually dying out. Such was the case, for example, in Britain and France. With the development of the productive forces, the bourgeoisie changes from being a new class playing a progressive role to being an old class playing a reactionary role, until it is finally overthrown by the proletariat and becomes a class deprived of privately owned means of production and stripped of power, when it, too, gradually dies out. The proletariat, which is much more numerous than the bourgeoisie and grows simultaneously with it but under its rule, is a new force. Initially subordinate to the bourgeoisie, gradually gains strength, becomes an independent class playing the leading role in history, and finally seizes political power and becomes the ruling class. Thereupon, the nature of society changes, and the old capitalist society becomes the new socialist society. You'll have to see it. This is the path already taken by the Soviet Union, a path that all other countries will inevitably take. He says, communism will win. Reading on. Look at China, for instance. Imperialism occupies the principal position in the contradiction in which China has been reduced to a semi-colony. It oppresses the Chinese people, and China has been changed from an independent country into a semi-colonial one. But this state of affairs will inevitably change. In the struggle between the two sides, the power of the Chinese people, which is growing under the leadership of the proletariat, will inevitably change China from a semi-colony into an independent country. Whereas imperialism will be overthrown, and old China will inevitably change into new China. The change of old China. I got lost. No, right. And how right he was, by the way. Oh my gosh. He says, the change of old China into new China also involves a change in the relation between the old feudal forces and the new popular forces within the country. And right he was. The old feudal landlord class will be overthrown, and from being the ruler, it will change into being the ruled. And this class, too, will eventually die out. From being the ruled, From being the ruled, the people, led by the proletariat, will become the rulers. See, this is what he means by they change into each other. It doesn't mean like, it doesn't mean the people like throw on crowns and shit, you know? Although there probably will be stealing of crowns. Let's be honest. Thereupon, the nature of Chinese society will change, and the old semi-colonial and semi-feudal society will change into a new democratic society. Instances of such reciprocal transformation are found in our past experience. The Qing dynasty, which ruled China for nearly 300 years, was overthrown by the Revolution of 1911. And the revolutionary Tongmenghui, under Sun Yat-sen's leadership, was victorious for a time. In the Revolutionary War of 1924 to 1927, the revolutionary forces of the Communist Kuomintang alliance in the South changed from being weak to being strong and won victory in the Northern Expedition, while the Northern warlords who once ruled the roost were overthrown. I'm not going to get into this stuff. I could tell you all about it. Or rather, I could read a Wikipedia summary of these things, but I'm just going to skip it. He's saying reciprocal transformation is found in society, and he gives examples. Okay, so he says in 1927, the People's Forces led by the Communist Party were greatly reduced numerically under the attacks of Kuomintang reaction. Of course, the Kuomintang were like the nationalists who were not communists. But with the elimination of opportunism within their ranks, they gradually grew again. In the revolutionary base under communist leadership, in the revolutionary base areas, I think he's talking about the Yan'an period, right? The peasants have been transformed from being the ruled to being the rulers, while the landlords have undergone a reverse transformation. And again, he's not saying that the tenants or whatever become landlords. That's not what he's saying. That's not when he says that aspects of a contradiction transform into each other. He doesn't mean that the like people transform into other people or something, you know. It means the aspects of the relationship transform into the other. Does that make sense? So the peasant feudal relationship isn't resolved by the peasants throwing crowns on, and the feudal lords becoming the peasants. uh, it wouldn't work. That's not how it works. The contradiction between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat will not be resolved by the proletariat moving into the penthouses and running the stock exchange or something. If that makes sense. No, it's not going to be like that movie with Eddie Murray and Dan Aykroyd. It's not that. That ain't it. It means the elements of their contradiction transform into the other. Okay, I hope that helps understand. Helps you understand. I think that I'm planting a seed of understanding of what we're actually going to be talking about in future sections. Actually, in the next section, section 5. I think I'm spoiling the next section here. At the same time, I'm practicing how to explain it because it's weird. I love this philosophy shit, you know? It's just abstract and strange and tickles my brain in a delicious way. That is so weird. Why did I say that? All right, reading on. So he says, at certain times. Did I read this part? I'm gonna read this next part. This last sentence here. He says, it is always so in the world. Things transforming in aspects transforming into the other. The new displacing the old superseding by the old being eliminated to make way for the new, and the new emerging out of the old. And that is how the world works. At certain times in the revolutionary struggle, the difficulties outweigh the favorable conditions and so constitute the principal aspect of the contradiction, and the favorable contradictions constitute the secondary aspect. But through their efforts, the revolutionaries can overcome the difficulties step by step and open up a favorable new situation. Thus, a difficult situation yields place to a favorable one. This is what happened after the failure of the revolution in China in 1927 and during the long march of the Chinese Red Army. In the present Sino-Japanese War, China is again in a difficult situation. But we can change this and fundamentally transform the situation as between China and Japan. Conversely, favorable conditions can be transformed into difficulty if the revolutionaries make mistakes. Thus, the victory of the revolution of 1924 to 1927 turned into defeat. The revolutionary base areas, which grew up in the southern provinces after 1927, had all suffered defeat by 1934. When we engage in study, the same holds good for the contradiction in the passage from ignorance to knowledge. At the very beginning of our study of Marxism, our ignorance of, our scanty acquaintance with Marxism stands in contradiction to knowledge of Marxism. By assiduous study, ignorance can be transformed into knowledge, scanty knowledge into substantial knowledge, and blindness in the application of Marxism into mastery of its application. Some people think that this is not true of certain contradictions. For instance, in the contradiction between the productive forces and the relations of production, the productive forces are the principal aspect. Everyone gets that's it. That's your world. That's it. That's like it, you guys. He just explained the foundation of society itself. He says, in the contradiction between theory and practice, practice is the principal aspect. He says that's how you be a communist. He says, in the contradiction between the economic base and the superstructure, the economic base is the principal aspect. He says that's how to look at the world. And he says, and there is no change in their respective positions. This is the mechanical materialist conception, not the dialectical materialist conception. Wait, did I just get confused in there? We'll see. Let's just keep reading. True, the productive forces practice. Oh, okay. This is okay. Let's put it this way. These are generally true. This is the mechanical materialist conception, as in it pretends that in all cases, the contradiction between theory and practice is the principal aspect. That's generally true. That is generally true. However, he's saying if you think that's always true, that's mechanical materialist conception. And so that's how I got confused. Okay. So true, the productive forces practice and the economic base generally play the principal and decisive role. Generally. Whoever denies this is not a materialist. But it must also be admitted that in certain conditions, such aspects as the relations of production, theory, and the superstructure in turn manifest themselves in the principal and decisive role. That is dialectical materialism. When it is impossible for the productive forces to develop without a change in the relations of production, then the change in the relations of production plays the principal and decisive role. It's like it's like he's saying time itself squeezes all contradictions, and when certain aspects of one contradiction does not allow for the development in given conditions, it could lead to like a rupture, like something pops. Imagine like you're squeezing a balloon. When a balloon pops, it's not like the entire balloon shatters, you know? It like pops out one side, like the weakest point. Or where there's so much force on a weak point. Does that track? It leads to a rupture, a fundamental change. So, yeah. Okay. Maybe I'm lost in the analogy, but let's keep reading. He says the creation and advocacy of revolutionary theory plays the principal and decisive role in those times of which Lenin said, without revolutionary theory, there can be no revolutionary movement. And yeah, let's be serious. If I can just monologue here for a second. Does anyone think there's like a revolutionary movement in the West? Is there a real revolutionary movement? It feels like there are like cadres of like reading groups, sort of like this, and like social democratic, and I'm saying that pejoratively, like organizations that are fundamentally settler colonial brained and infiltrated by liberal Zionists, such as the DSA with 44%. It's book clubs and adventurism and like I want to say petty resistance, as in not major resistance. Not to put down any forms of actual resistance. However, it's like it's Star Wars, and we just keep getting our asses wrecked by the Empire, and like all we're doing is like taking out a TIE fighter or two. When we're lucky, we can take out a Death Star, but like they just make another one because they have the money, and we don't. At least that's so in the core of Empire, where I live. I think we're seeing on the fringes of Empire. That's where we're seeing like real revolutionary shit, and the so-called revolutionaries within the imperial core, within the heart of Empire, oftentimes point and go, "No, don't do that. You have to resist peacefully." Shut the fuck up. So, I don't know. It could be argued that the primary task right now for comrades in the Imperial Corps is the creation and advocacy of revolutionary theory, so we can plant the seeds of revolutionary thought and put the tools together and raise the kind of consciousness that we need to create the conditions under which revolution in the heart of Empire can occur, and or plant the consciousness within Empire, and maybe others who may be reading this or hearing this content, so that those on the fringes of Empire can develop their own tasks. But I think you see why I do what I do in my role. I'm trying to create and advocate revolutionary theory. I'm doing that right now. Wow, I'm doing it. Don't be mad at me. I'm trying my best, okay? So reading on, he says, when a task, no matter which, has to be performed, but there is as yet no guiding line, method, plan, or policy, the principal and decisive thing is to decide on a guiding line, method, plan, or policy. When the superstructure, politics, culture, etc., obstructs the development of the economic base, political and cultural changes become principal and decisive. Yeah. So imagine the economic base is a balloon, and it's being filled with water. Or something. And when politics or culture gets in the way of the development of the filling up of the balloon with water, those things become the focus and the most important thing in the equation, because we got to fill that balloon with water. Am I right? Or something. I don't know. It sort of worked. Okay, let's read on. Are we going against materialism when we say this? No. The reason is that While we recognize that in the general development of history, the material determines the mental and the social being determines determines social consciousness, we also, and indeed must, recognize the reaction of mental on material things, of social consciousness on social being, and of the superstructure on the economic base. Yes, we know that the economic base is dominant in human society. You know, it's dominant over that of the superstructure of politics, of culture. But it doesn't mean that politics and culture can't become dominant for a short time, even though generally it's not dominant. It's secondary. This is not going against materialism. This is not going against Marxism. He says, on the contrary, it avoids mechanical materialism. It avoids what's called vulgar materialism. And it firmly upholds dialectical materialism. It firmly upholds Marx. In studying the particularity of contradiction, unless we examine these two facets, the principal and the non-principal contradictions in a process, and the principal and the non-principal aspects of a contradiction. Again, unless we examine these two facets, that is, unless we examine the distinctive character of these two facets of contradiction, we shall get bogged down in abstractions, be unable to understand contradiction concretely, and consequently be unable to find the correct method of resolving it. He says, this is why all this shit that I just said, this is why it's important. So if you didn't get it, go back and reread it. The distinctive character or particularity of these two facets of contradiction represents the unevenness of the forces that are in contradiction. Nothing in this world develops absolutely unevenly. Absolutely evenly. Nothing develops absolutely evenly. Sorry. We must oppose the theory of even development or the theory of equilibrium. Moreover, it is these concrete features of a contradiction and the changes in the principal and non-principal aspects of a contradiction in the course of its development that manifest the force of the new superseding the old. The study of the various states of unevenness in contradictions, of the principal and non-principal contradictions, and of the principal and the non-principal aspects of a contradiction, constitutes an essential method by which a revolutionary political party correctly determines its strategic and tactical policies, both in political and in military affairs. All communists must give it attention. That was section 4. Section 4, the principal contradiction and the principal aspect of a contradiction. In this section, Mao said, you know, guys, everything real in this universe, including human society and thought, is in an ocean or current of contradictions in forward motion. They're changing each other and they're changing themselves at the same time. At any time in a given contradiction, one aspect is the dominant aspect, the other secondary. And when there are a number of contradictions in the development of something, one contradiction plays, at any point of the development of something, one contradiction plays the leading and decisive role, while the contradictions the other contradictions occupy a secondary and subordinate position. They sit in the cuck chair. Anyone serious about changing reality to better fit the interests of the masses better understand this process and apply it in study before making any plans. That's what he says. That was section 4. Join us next time. Section 5, the identity and struggle of the aspects. The identity and struggle of the aspects of a contradiction. If you enjoyed reading this or listening or whatever, please support. It means a lot. Thank you very much.